Hello and welcome to this session as part of Financial Inclusion Week 2023, where we're going to have a panel discussion about the question, in a cashless world, who gets left behind? I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and I'm delighted to be joined for the discussion by two fantastic guests. We have, first up, Andrea Tucinu, who is the Director of Studies, Perspective and Training at Patelia Consulting. Andrea, great to have you joining the panel.
Thank you, David. Hello.
And we also have Charlotte Pascal, who is an R&D project manager at Worldline. Hi, Charlotte. Great to have you on the panel as well.
Hello, David. Nice to be here.
So in a moment, I really want to get the discussion started. But first of all, I thought it's worth sharing that at Worldline and in the Discovery Hub, we've been doing some research and some work on the topic of financial inclusion, and particularly financial inclusion around digital payments. And we're publishing some of our findings in the next edition of our Navigating Digital Payments report. So in this report, we had a chapter called In a Cashless World, Who Gets Left Behind? And I just want to share a few of the insights from that chapter before we get started with the panel discussion. So one of the things we looked at was this trend towards cashlessness. And as you can see from this chart, this is still very much something that is happening in the world. You see that in emerging markets, there is still relatively high usage of cash, but it is declining, and you see particular examples there of Brazil and India. So in Brazil, they introduced PIX, an alternative payment means, which has actually gained a lot of traction, displaced a lot of cash usage, and in fact now is processing more transactions than credit and debit cards combined. And then in India, of course, we've seen the phenomenal success of the Unified Payment Interface, UPI, which again has driven a big adoption of digital payments, replacing what was previously cash transactions. In advanced economies, it's quite interesting. You're still seeing this further shift towards cashlessness, with some countries really almost approaching the status of being cashless societies. So you see there Sweden and the Netherlands are now down at 9 and 8% of transactions being cash. And of course it depends a little bit as well on your definition of a cashless society, because some people would say that cashless society means there is no cash, no cash issued anymore by the banks, no cash in circulation, all payments being digital. But some people would take a slightly softer view and say that actually a cashless society is one where you always have the option to pay digitally. So you no longer need cash to make payments and to buy things. And certainly one thing, of course, that then comes with this is that as society becomes more and more cashless, people who, for whatever reason, either struggle to adopt digital payments or may simply prefer not to use digital payments, they may become more and more excluded. And in this report, we looked at 8 different categories of people who can find it harder to adopt digital payments. And I would say some of these are probably quite obvious. So the unbanked population, clearly if you don't have a bank account, especially in Western Europe, it's quite a lot harder then to have a digital means to pay. Some are perhaps cliches or stereotypes. So this idea that elderly people are perhaps a little bit less willing or able to adopt digital technology. But we also have ones like digital laggards, who we classified as people who have access to digital ways to pay and have the skills to pay digitally, but for whatever reason are choosing not to, or preferring to use cash. And of course what we found was that for these people who are unwilling or unable to use digital payments, there are a number of potential downsides that they face. So this can be things like the poverty premium. In the UK we have examples of people having to pay more for services, often for utilities, if they can't pay digitally, if they can't set up a direct debit, for example. The other thing that we find is that people who are not paying digitally find it harder to kind of build up a history of their financial transactions, harder to get a good credit rating, and that means that if they're able to borrow money, they're often having to pay a higher interest rate than those who have been able to use digital payments and who have been able to build up a better credit history. So having shared a little bit of the work that we've done there in the Discovery Hub around financial inclusion, let's get the discussion started. And Andrea, maybe first I can come to you and take a step back, starting by looking at cash. So when you think about cash, do you see cash as an inclusive way to pay? And maybe you can talk about whether you see any issues around the use of cash.
Yes, David, thank you for your question. I think that cash is a very inclusive means of payments. If we refer to the last report published by ECB called Space about the uses in payments in Europe, we observe a decline in the use of cash in Europe in comparison with electronic uses and above all cards. Despite this trend, the possibility to have access to cash is always considered as a strong value for European consumers. And we also see an increase of the numbers of Europeans that have cash at home. It is a very interesting figure. Furthermore, the same observation is done by the European Association of Consumers that you may know, BEUC. Many countries with a strong maturity in digital payments, like for instance Sweden or even Luxembourg, want to preserve the access to cash. So I think that cash is seen as a very inclusive tool for consumers who don't want to pay or do not have the capacity to pay with electronic tools. And it is also important to remind that some countries, like France, for instance, attest that retailers have an obligation to accept cash. It is, for instance, one of the decisions of the French Comité National des Moyens de Paiement. So I think that cash is a very inclusive means of payments, and this tool will not disappear tomorrow.
And it's an interesting point you make that even in countries where the majority of the population, 99% have access to digital payment methods, often a significant number still value having cash as an option. I guess you also mentioned the keeping cash at home, where I think, of course, cash, where it's different to digital payments, is cash is also a store of value. It's not just a way of transferring money. But then I wonder whether there aren't some security implications for storing a lot of cash in your house. And of course, it's not appreciating any interest. So it's kind of losing value over time if you store significant amounts of value in cash. So I suppose there's different aspects to it there. Charlotte, perhaps before we come on to digital payments, we could talk more generally about digital technology. I mean, do you have some views about why people don't like to use digital technology or struggle to use digital technology?
Well, I think it's in the context of the digital transformation, and we have studied the population who could be struggling with digital services, and in fact we see that some of them lack of digital skills. They don't understand how it works, or they feel it feels strange for them. But on the other hand, they also have fear for this digital world, because with all that they are hearing, they fear that they could be tracked on digital services. They have this kind of mistrust, and this is why some of them are still hesitating or reticent to use that kind of services.
So I suppose, as you say, it's two angles. One is they may not have the skills to use digital tools and technology. The other can be a fear around, as you said, fraud or security. I certainly remember when my mother-in-law was first offered a contactless card, she was very worried about the idea that this card could be used to pay for things without any PIN required, and thinking, well, that doesn't seem very secure. So I do remember that was a fear she had. Um, Andrea, maybe coming back to you and then going a little bit more specifically to payments. Are these the same kind of reasons that people might not want to use digital payments, or are there other reasons when it comes to digital payments?
I totally agree with the observations of Charlotte. I think that considering the issues of electronic payments imply many analyses. As Charlotte said, there are some economical and technological issues. Some people don't have the financial capacity to have electronic tools, or simply don't want to use it, or they don't know how to use it, so they are reluctant. There are also some consumers with specific profiles and that cannot access to these electronic tools, electronic payments. I think, for instance, about homeless people or even refugees. And last but not least, in some EU countries, we also observe a geographical issue with some cities that have not a good internet access. It is, for instance, the case in Portugal. It is also important, I think, if we consider the issues of electronic payments, to not forget the persons who have access to the technologies but who don't want to use it because they have privacy concerns or even environment concerns. It is not the majority, I will say, but we observe this situation in some EU countries like France, for instance. It is a very interesting point.
So as you say, Andrea, it's the case that even in countries where they're quite advanced with people having access to digital payments, many people still want to have the option to use cash sometimes. Charlotte, maybe I can come to you and just ask you, do you think it actually matters whether people have access to digital payments? I mean, if we keep cash going forever, then is it a problem if people can't access digital payments?
As Andrea mentioned it, the cash is decreasing in Europe and in many places. It's only used mainly for proximity payments, maybe smaller amounts. And now other payment means like card are more used than cash because they can limit fraud, and you also have a better user experience sometimes, with the technological evolution, the contactless in store or in public transport, it's becoming easier. So we see that we have this evolution with a less cash society, but we have to maintain cash, maybe to include everyone, as we saw. Some people don't want to use or can't use digital payment. They can access it, so it's still a societal challenge. And we prefer to talk about less cash society or less cash evolution than totally cashless, because we still need cash for these inclusion purposes.
And I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, many of us would think of using cash, as you say, in proximity transactions, so where you're there in person and you can hand the cash over, and probably usually not super high value transactions, so you wouldn't want to buy a house or a car necessarily with cash for security reasons. So although cash is maybe convenient for a lot of transactions, if you actually don't have access to digital payments at all, it's probably not so convenient for an online purchase or for a large high value purchase. That's interesting. Maybe related to that, Andrea, it's an interesting question. I mean, if people want to stay cash only, really want to stay off the grid, so to speak, do you think is it getting easier? Is it getting harder to sort of only use cash for your payments and your transactions?
In fact, in many EU countries, we see a lot of concerns about the access to cash. These issues are linked with the disappearance of banking agencies and ATM. But despite these concerns, it is important to have in mind that some studies show that the access to cash remains good in Europe thanks to alternative means of access like cashback, for instance. We saw that in France. Nevertheless, it is important to highlight that European consumers feel more and more incited to pay digitally by banks and also by other services like public administrations. That's why the concerns linked with the access to cash are more and more important. But despite this aspect, it is important to remind that even if the trend evolves towards digital payments, as Charlotte said, the full electronic is not an option for many banking actors and institutions, and we will see complementary tools in the field of payments area. I want to mention a good illustration. It is the project of Digital Euro that you may know. ECB told many times that this innovation will not replace cash. The idea is to have a complementary tool.
And I think it's interesting you mentioned there two sides really of using cash, which is you have to have access to cash, i.e. you need to be able to get it out of the bank or out of the ATM, but of course you also need merchants that accept it. And as you said, in some countries like France, cash acceptance is mandatory, but in other countries like the UK, cash acceptance is not mandatory. And certainly I went on a holiday recently in the UK where there was no cash accepted at all. More and more frequently on buses, you need a contactless card to be able to pay on the bus. So many use cases where cash used to be the default or sometimes the only option in the UK, that option is starting to disappear. And as you said, you both need to be able to withdraw the cash and you also need to be able to spend it if it's to be maintained as a useful payment instrument. Charlotte, maybe coming on to one of the difficulties, I suppose, that we can see, which is that, I mean, cash usage is declining, and actually often then the cost of providing cash as an option per transaction is increasing because a lot of the costs are kind of, fixed. It's like the merchant has to take the cash to the bank and it's the same cost whether they do it for a small amount of money or a large amount of money. So the fewer cash transactions they have, the higher the cost of cash is to them. Do you think there are ways that the costs of cash can be minimized?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, as you said, and the cost of cash is also higher because of the inflation, which decreased the cash power. So it's a bigger challenge. Before it was managed by the proximity of ATM and banks, and now I think it's more a regulatory challenge. It will depend on the will and the choices of the authorities. And we see in some countries that the governments choose to try to convince people to use mobile payment, for instance, and it's like the initiatives in Brazil, for instance, with Pix, or in India with UPI. So these are mobile payment solutions that are really supported by the governments. And maybe that could be a way to manage and to accompany the less cash evolution. But it depends on the regulators.
Yeah, and it's I know, and where you also mentioned the digital euro as an example, I think it's something that's driven somewhat from the regulatory side. And I think maybe a final sort of question to you both to close on is really, we've talked about cash, the benefits of cash and why some people prefer to use cash. We've also talked about the costs and some of the challenges around using cash. And of course, we've talked about digital payments and why people might struggle to use digital payments or choose not to use them. Maybe what I'd like to finish off from both of you is understanding what you think could be done concretely to make digital payments more inclusive. So Andrea, perhaps you'd be willing to go first on that.
Yes, thank you. I think that first of all, it is important to preserve the approach of full range of payments, including electronic tools and also traditional ones like cash, because as Charlotte mentioned, it is important to have a diversity in terms of means of payments. Then I think it is important to work about the accessibility of payments at a technological level. I think that it is already the case in some countries like France and Portugal, for instance, in relation with the directive to come. It is important also to work about economic issues, since finance can be also an important element of inclusion. And finally, another interesting point is also to work about information and communication to foster financial and payments literacy. It is an important point, and we see many initiatives in diverse EU countries. I think, for instance, about Portugal, where we saw in the field of Fórum para os Sistemas de Pagamento, that is a national committee to work in the field of payments, we saw that the first priority of this committee was educational aspects. And we observe, in relation with this strategy, an interesting boost in the use of digital tools. So education and information are a strong point for the inclusion. It is important to have this aspect in mind, and maybe a key figure, 5 million of users of the wallet MBWay in Portugal in September. So I think that information and communication is also an element to have in mind to work about inclusion. And I will add finally that inclusion is becoming a strong issue in the digital world, so it is important to foster an approach of inclusion by design and to ensure that this aspect is integrated in the creation of all the products and services linked with payments.
I think it's a really strong point you make, Andrea, that it's both the design of the products and the services themselves, but it's also education and information for end users so that they can both use them, but also use them in a way that is good for them. Charlotte, how about from your side? Do you see some key ways that digital payments can be made more inclusive?
Well, first, I totally agree with what Andrea just explained with the inclusive by design. I think the first thing is about user experience and designing better payment journeys that would be more inclusive and inclusive by design. And the second point would be to increase the trust in the digital payment, by working on the security aspects and also the transparency. Explaining how these payment means are in fact secure and protect the data of the user, etc. And the third point, but Andrea explained it as well, is to have a better people support to facilitate the use of digital payments, because they will understand both the financial aspects and also how to use this payment means. And for that, we can count on emerging technologies, maybe, like the AI tools, which allow us to create some automatic support for the customers, and use generative AI and more natural language interfaces. And also the biometry can ease the payment journey and work on the frictions, and maybe propose some seamless payments.
Yeah, so I could see what you're saying there, that some technologies like AI and biometrics could help make digital payments easier to use for a wider range of society. I think also what this discussion at the end here has reminded me of is that very often things that you do to make something more accessible or more inclusive actually also improves the experience for other people as well who are already using those products or services. So many things you can do to make things inclusive actually have a benefit beyond just the inclusion itself. So I must say that was a really fascinating discussion, and it was really interesting to hear both of your insights on this topic of cash, digital payments, and how they can be made fully inclusive. So Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Charlotte. It was a pleasure.
And Charlotte, thank you very much as well for your insights during this session.
Thank you, David. I think it was really insightful.
And of course, last of all, thank you to everyone who's joined us for this session, and we hope you have a great rest of Financial Inclusion Week 2023.